Good evening, and welcome to Proposals for Novel Ways of Being, Circuit Breaker. This is the first in a series of talks and programs inaugurated by Proposals for Novel Ways of Being, a range of exhibitions and programs variously organized by 12 Singapore institutions, art spaces, and collectives, broadly in late 2020 in response to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Eugene Tan, Director of the National Gallery Singapore and the Singapore Art Museum. We're very pleased tonight to have Professor Homi Bhabha with us. So taking its subtitle from Singapore's version of a lockdown to limit the spread of the virus, Circuit Breaker is a series of talks and roundtables where speakers and interlocutors from various fields of thought and practice are invited to respond to the current crisis as an opportunity for change and a role that museums and organizations can play. We'll have time for questions later, so please do post any questions you may have in the comments section. But let me introduce our speaker for tonight. Homi K. Bhabha is the N.F. Rothenberg Professor of the Humanities at Harvard University and one of the most important figures in contemporary post-colonial studies. He has authored numerous works exploring post-colonial theory, cultural change and power, contemporary art, and cosmopolitanism. We're very honored to hear him speak today as he shares his reflection on the topic of unpreparedness and the situation that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought onto the world. Welcome, Homi, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Eugene. It's my great pleasure to be here today, and I'd like to thank all my colleagues at the National Gallery for having made this possible. You've worked so generously to achieve this evening, and I very much hope to give you the best that I have from Washington, D.C., where I am at the moment. So, good evening to you. And it's my great pleasure to be in Singapore, a city I love, I love to visit, a city I love to roam around in, a city I love to eat in. So it gives me great pleasure vicariously to be in Singapore for breakfast this morning, my time, for dinner, your time. Thank you so much for having me. I thought I'd start with a few words about my thoughts in this moment, the moment of the pandemic, but also the moment of worldwide protests against racial inequality and the violence that the state can sometimes inflict on its own citizens. So here it is. I've been thinking these thoughts around the general issue of what it means to be unprepared. When a pandemic hits you, when a large natural tragedy hits you, citizens and individuals are unprepared for their fate. It is not as if they are not forewarned. It is not as if these things have not happened before. But when they happen, there's a great sense of anxiety and fear because you feel you're caught in the middle of a transitional moment, a traumatic moment, and you don't exactly know how it will end. That's one sense of the unprepared I want to explore with you today. But there is another way in which around the world we have governments, majoritarian governments today, governments that are called ethno-nationalist or ethno-populist governments. And I'm suggesting that they also keep their citizens in a situation of anxiety and unpreparedness so that their more authoritarian policies can be more quickly and effectively imposed on populations. So before I started, I thought I would just give you these two central ideas. I'll now proceed to speak. In the Life and Arts section of the Weekend Financial Times of May the 9th, Gillian Tett, chair of the Financial Times US editorial board, published a front page article titled Against the Odds. Her essay is a reflection on risk as an existential predicament involving individuals and institutions who find themselves on the anxious knife edge of hazardous choices. Those who are risk averse choose a future protected by norms of reasonableness, predictable security, and cautious optimism. Risk takers summon up the Dutch courage to face precarious futures of doubt and danger in the hope that contingency and risk itself may unlock unimagined realms of agency, liberty, and opportunity. In the midst of quarantine cabin fever, Gillian Tett prizes open the porthole to speculate on the risks of a post-lockdown future. Tett asks, how will governments and individuals weigh the difficult daily decisions facing us when we leave lockdown? Now, as you know, for many countries, lockdown part two has also started again. People have been re-locked down because of the mismanagement of the virus. Her answers derive primarily from her expertise as a financial journalist immersed in the risk management of markets and financial institutions. This time around, however, Tett focuses on the culture of risk. Culture matters, she writes emphatically, as she lays out her leading argument. Medical data and economic trade-offs will certainly play an important part in any decision governments and individuals make to return to public communal styles of life. But as we juggle with risk, as she writes, supposedly neutral data, risk models, and forecasts, she argues, will have to come to terms with psychological biases, cultural assumptions, and inconsistent incentives. Because, she argues, medical science can reveal death rates and frame mortality risks, but models cannot tell us when and how we might feel safe. In a place like America, Tett concludes, it is also possible to imagine a rebellion whereby the burden of risk is handed back to the individual and the government takes little responsibility for it. Now, Tett is obviously referring to COVID-related deaths, and the post-lockdown rebellion she imagines would most likely be staged by Trumpian ethno-nationalists for whom wearing a mask seems to be an affront to their First Amendment rights, which one assumes includes the right to create pandemic pandemonium in the service of making America great again. But Tett's speculations on the risk to human death in the aftermath of the lockdown, considered in the wake of the risk to black lives on the public highway at the hands of the police, as we saw in the George Floyd event, lead me to further reflect on the language of risk and the nature of rebellion as part of the post-lockdown predicament. We were cautiously expecting to emerge from the lockdown, to embrace some version of our public lives and reclaim something of the shared freedoms of public spaces. What we were quite unprepared for was the tragic resumption of public life as a result of an unwarranted and unprovoked public death. Instead of gathering on neighborhood streets, maintaining the hygiene of social distancing, bystanders in the Powderhorn district of Minneapolis witnessed the curbside killing of George Floyd, all 8.46 minutes of his dying agony, as Derek Chauvin, a white police officer, extinguished a life with the pressure of his knee. Despite Floyd's repeated pleas for mercy, "I can't breathe," and witnesses imploring Chauvin to desist, he dug his knee further into Floyd's neck. The phrase, "I can't breathe," according to the New York Times, has been used by arrested individuals 70 times over the past decade for issues that are not seen to be major acts of violence. These are not trivial issues, but people have been arrested on fairly regular issues, and yet the treatment of them has been such that, as I said, the phrase "I can't breathe," according to the New York Times, has been used 70 times over the past decade. And 50% of those occasions, the person saying "I can't breathe" has been an African American. I just put that out there for your consideration. Protesters the world over were ethically unprepared to stand by and witness another violation of the rights of Black citizens that resulted in the death of a Black man whose life did not matter in the name of law and order. Multitudes across the world decided to risk their health and, in some cases, even their livelihoods in the time of COVID to stand up as a free citizenry and as upstanding residents for issues of global inequality, injustice against minorities, and the tyranny of ethno-nationalist leaders democratically elected, who in these current crises have played fast and loose with issues of public health, criminal justice, and state violence. Those of us whose primary professional associations are with cultural institutions, such as museums and universities, the protests against global inequality and injustice proved to be an affirmation of the leading role played by the arts and humanities. In cities stretching from Minnesota to Manchester, Paris to Sydney, to say nothing of Singapore, the George Floyd murals adorned walls and facades. The iconic image of Floyd often bore a resemblance to the features and cultures in which the Floyd face appeared. The murals were more than portrayals of a single individual, of George Floyd, the African American murdered in Minnesota. The Floyd murals provided a mirror to the society in which they were installed. The gaze of the murals looked directly at local conditions of violence and oppression, racism and majoritarianism, inequality and indignity. And in each Floyd portrait, painted in local styles and regional colors, was a portrait of the society that surrounded the image itself. From the perspective of cultural imaging and aesthetic representations, these murals represented global translations of the universal spirit of rights and freedoms as they relate to the specific conditions of living in the cities, in the towns, in the regions in which these images, these murals, turned their gaze upon their own societies. Cultural translation, as distinct from cultural transmission, is the basis on which museums establish a productive dialogue, engaging issues of the equality of difference, not the appropriation of identities and sameness. Museums are the great social institutions of translation. They do not simply give you a sense of the lineage of culture, but by placing various cultures, various periods of art side by side with one another, they introduce to us the importance, the humanistic importance of being able to interpret and translate not simply one work, but the relationship between works from different periods, different cultures, and different locations. The museum is a great place for translated conversations, which is why it is a place where inequality, where the barriers between cultures are continually being defied and broken down. The museum is a place of conversations built on translation. The moment of the unprepared with which I started is, of course, a figurative measure of time, as is indeed the notion of a period or an age or any other such definition of the historical past through which we construct the meanings of events and construe their social customs. But the unprepared carries with it an affective, emotional charge of a political or historical moment of suddenness, a stunning illustration of emotion leading to action and cognition. It is this very temporality of suddenness that makes the advent of both COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter a global phenomenon. We knew all about the science of pandemics. We knew all about the racialization of police power. But we were quite simply unprepared for the suddenness and severity of both pandemic and protest as they dovetailed and became entangled in our everyday lives. What does it mean to be unprepared for something that has a long history of happening? Record pandemics have occurred for several hundred years, and police killings of Black men and women in avoidable and unjust circumstances in the UK as in the US are part of a recurrent cycle of institutional racial violence. And yet, the moment of being unprepared, the global response, for instance, to the last 8.46 minutes of Floyd's life circulated on social media is rarely recognized as a significant feature of public historical life. Very often, the moment in which these things happen is slowly forgotten in the long institutional memory of structural racism or structural violence. One of the great things that happened this time round was the way in which the short period of time, that 8.46 minutes, got turned into the images of the murals of George Floyd. Dancers danced for 8.46 minutes. Theater pieces were made to the length of 8.46 minutes. And this is only to tell you how significant it is that culture plays a role on holding on to those images, those moments that can so easily be forgotten in the discourse of policy or can so easily be forgotten on the front page of the next day's newspaper. In that sense, museums, universities, artists of all kinds hold these memories of the small moment and make them memorable not simply by blowing them up into a large scale, but by appreciating how in a small detail there lies the story of a much larger history. I have chosen this term, the unprepared, for two reasons. First, it speaks of contingent circumstances I've just described to you, in which people find themselves at a loss for action and agency. They're unprepared for an event or eventuality because at that point they think their destiny is out of their hands. Secondly, the term is also one to which governments, resorting in evading their states of unpreparedness, choose to explain away their culpability and responsibility when faced with consequences of misgovernance and miscalculation. In such circumstances, governments resort to the language of crisis and emergency in order to argue that their failures are only a consequence of overwhelming causes and circumstances. So governments who are so predisposed can use these moments of unpreparedness, moments in which they are in themselves politically neutral, like a virus, but they can use them to re-regulate their policies, to use them to further constrain the freedom of their people. The ubiquitous use of the phrase being unprepared in the media and public discourse is not merely a matter of words. Unpreparedness is descriptive of events and experiences as they occur in the present, but it is also a term for a future predicament of what I would call predictive precariousness that shapes the way in which we conceive of the relation between knowledge and action, or principle and policy, as they shape the citizen's consciousness of the future. So a government is able to use this precariousness for predictive policies of the future. Increasingly, with the rampant disregard for fact, science, history, and human dignity displayed by many governments across the world and by those who occupy the highest offices in countries around the world, citizens and residents are being actively unprepared to stand up for their democratic rights and representations, or to organize around these public goods by the exercise of discriminatory laws, punitive regulations, censorship, and the depredations of social media. This leads then to the worst excesses of social polarization and ethnic tensions amongst those who are the least empowered and entitled in our societies. The governance of the unprepared can obviously and often be used to further anti-democratic or populist policies and beliefs amongst a population who are themselves, as in the pandemic, in a state of vulnerability and they're least equipped to be able to resist these kinds of governmental strategies of keeping the citizens themselves in a state of fear, anxiety, and unpreparedness. How then can the museum as an institution and the curator as its agent act as good citizens in a situation of unpreparedness, of two types of unpreparedness that I have just discussed with you? Is the work of art a symptom of this general materialist mass consumption, or is it an icon, a model of an education for civility and cultural citizenship to which we must aspire? These are questions of critical importance to the demographic and regional transformations of our own day. Will a museum or a work of art simply be a symptom, or can cultural institutions and cultural practices actually attempt to change, if not the very structures of society, certainly the way in which individuals, citizens, groups, and communities can rethink the structures of society that have been imposed upon them? Cultural institutions, I believe, have to raise their game to address the sensitivities and sensibilities of minorities and marginalized peoples whose access to universities and museums have been held back by poorly resourced education systems. The public demand for recognition and representation across the world by underprivileged and underrepresented groups isn't often met by the slow and selective redistribution of cultural goods that comes to be known as cultural policy, particularly with the advent of social media, when people feel they can respond much more quickly to issues. The whole slow churning machine of policy change doesn't satisfy their aspirations. Not all aspirations on social media need to be addressed, but there is a sum of positive aspirations that need to be addressed quicker than the slow wheels of public policy. This disparity is often represented as a conflict in our culture between elite tastes and mass demands. The idea is that museums have an elite perspective, and popular demands, the demands of the marginalized, the demands of the undocumented, the demands of the racialized, the demands of LGBTQ people, the demands of women, that these things are somehow popular demands on institutions that, quote unquote, know better. But I think this attitude has to change. This patrician attitude has to change, in my view. The problem lies not in treating inclusion as somehow as an incursion, a response to external social pressures of cultural diversity or ethnic differences. Inclusion should be seen as an internal, moral, aesthetic, political, and ethical audit, an audit of the cultural reach of any institution. It is an opportunity to engage in a spirit of renewal, not simply tolerance or accommodation, with its own defined and designated horizons of relevance and representation. Each museum, as a place of learning and luminosity, is also a site of certain historical lapses or losses, displacements and dislocations of both its objects and audiences. In this sense, I have said that it is no point thinking about demands of minorities or marginalized, underrepresented people as always a kind of incursion or a burden upon the museum. It should be the museum's active agency to audit, just as you would have an auditing process, to audit its own aesthetic and ethical purposes and projects. And I think here we have to be discriminating. Depending on what kind of a scale of museum you have, what is the history of your museum, what is the location of the museum, each act of auditing would be different. But the idea is the same. You take the responsibility to the changing audiences, the changing demands of society, the changing demographics of society. You make it your problem. It is not a problem brought to you. I think as soon as you begin to see that you make it your problem, however difficult, however unprepared you are for it, you take possession of the problem. You become the agent and you become the change agent. Displacement makes us reconsider our relation to art, not only as looking at an object, the still and lovely autonomy of art, But thinking in and thinking with an object to these other horizons of audit and inclusion that I have just mentioned. To think in and think with a work of art, to use a phrase bequeathed to us by the great scholar of Buddhist art Ananda Kumaraswamy, does not obscure the pleasure derived by the work of art and its presence, the beauty that appeals to the eye or the intuitive magic of its meaning. To think with and think in opens up the body of the work of art to the viewer's existential, phenomenological, and moral experience. To think in and to think with a work of art is not simply a visual education, it is an aesthetic and political identification with the work of the present. It seems to me that the term I use to think about the way in which a museum can link the past and the present, the inheritances of the past and the challenge of the present, and to turn them into a new translational space that addresses the current situation. Such a situation requires the museum to think about itself as a place of archival sustainability. The notion of the archival sustainability draws on the double etymology of the word curator. The Anglo-Norman notion of curator, one who has the care of displaced museum objects, all the objects to which the museum offers hospitality, which come from different periods and at different times, and the Latin notion of the curator as an overseer or steward of exhibition. Archival sustainability brings together the curatorial design of exhibition display with the curatorial ethical care for the destiny of the object itself. Archival sustainability, further, is an ethic of care. It is a practice of the trials of displacement. It is a way to address those who have been excluded and bring them back in to the community of the museum. Both care and displacement are difficult projects. They have to deal with disruption and with transition. And there can be no curatorial attention to the displacement, the disruption, or the translation of our times caused by pandemics or by migration or by unsettlement without us being open to the unprepared in a positive, agential way, to return to the opening theme of my lecture tonight. Let me just end by saying that the moment of unpreparedness, such as we are experiencing and will experience, for all its volatility and turbulence, marks also an essential turning point in the transition between our own anxiety of self-examination. Who are we in this moment of the pandemic? Why are we lost? Why are we puzzled? How do we remake our lives? And an unavoidable commitment to the public good. To be open to the unprepared, but not to be manipulated by the governance of the unpreparedness, is to develop a capacity to engage in the ethics of mutual and equal development, and to be committed to the modest art of listening and learning from cultures of difference, which is the beating heart of the democratic experiment across the world. COVID is epidemiologically a pandemic, a virus. However, COVID is also an epistemological displacement of our everyday lives, our everyday objects of knowledge, our habits, and our customs. In these times of social distancing and masking, crucial to the public health perspective, we must not forget the lesson of the museum experience, absolutely crucial from the perspective of public culture. We have to think of public health and public culture together. And that lesson that we learn from our memory of the museum as a crowded place, as a place of conversation, that even in that busyness of the museum and in the midst of the museum's business is the great learning experience of looking art in the eye, bringing your face as close as possible to the image of the object, in the conviction that it will look back at you, the great works will talk back to you, and together you will continue the conversations of mankind, the conversations of curatorial care and cultural creativity. And it is in this spirit that I ask you today, in another time of history and a troubled place of our own living across the world together, that you think of the George Floyd murals in the same way as you would think of an object or an artwork on the wall of a museum. Look at it, talk to it. Let that image of Floyd look at you and start your conversation about social justice, about collaboration, about peace and equality from that perspective, looking back at that mural, considering the history of why that image traveled across the world, across the media. That is my hope, that we begin to think about challenges in the world, having learned how to look and learn and interpret within the museum itself. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Homi, for that very rich perspective. There's really a lot for us to think about. And you address many, many issues in your talk that you just gave. But in particular, I wanted to pick up on what you were talking about, the museum's role in advocating for social justice issues, which museums all around the world seem, to use your term, unprepared for in this sense. So last year at the ICOM's General Assembly, ICOM being the International Committee of Museums, they tried to propose a new definition of what museums should be, moving away from museums' traditional roles in acquiring, conserving, and preserving and education towards a role um, sees museums as inclusive polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue, addressing conflicts and challenges of the present, upholding human dignity and social justice, as well as contributing to global equality and planetary well-being. It was very controversial, as you may imagine, so much so that the then president had to resign earlier this year, together with some board members. And ICOM is obviously an international committee, not just made up of museums in Europe and America, but all around the world. So this idea that museums now have to now play this role is not fully being recognized or accepted by museums all around the world. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, my dear Eugene, this question would be much better answered by you than me, but let me make a shot at it and then let's have a conversation around it. Now, the proposals that you laid out for change in the museum seem to be for the good. I mean, somebody who is not in the museum world and who does not know what the internal issues are would say, this is a great program. Of course, this is the way a museum should go. This would be a great enlightening moment. So I think we need to work out what is the resistance to these ideas and where does it come from. And I think in museums, or for museums as I know them, there is always an internal issue. There is an important internal issue which has external implications. And it's this: The things we want to achieve, I think, at the moment in society generally is both social justice on the one hand, in whatever institutions we're in, whether we're in businesses, universities, museums, everybody's talking about furthering the claims of social justice. And then for cultural institutions, there is the further issue of trying to establish cultural rights. Let me explain. Cultural rights are the idea that the museum has to be a free space, or if not a neutral space, because no institutions are neutral, it has to be a space where through free discussion between curators, audiences, and artists, you can represent a range of perspectives. You can represent a range of perspectives. You can represent a range of artists. Not all of them will sign on to the same progressive vision or whatever, but you cannot restrict the art historical or the cultural imprint of the society in which we live, which is a diverse and conflicted society. But of course, that's the great that's the great burden and also the great responsibility of democratic institutions to be able to show the conflicts. And you cannot show the conflicts if you only show one side of the argument and not the other. And artists fall on all kinds of sides of the conflict. So how do we get the social justice part of it together with the cultural rights and representations part of it? That is, I'm arguing in my own work with museums, the linchpin. But it's a difficult balance to get. Now, on the social justice side of it, there are very many institutional issues. Your recruiting, of diverse recruiting from communities, the care to see that there is institutionally no racism, no sexism, no gender bias within the promotional part of the museum, so that you're recruiting and you're creating a community as far as possible. In fact, it should be such a community of equality, of equal opportunity within the museum. Then, of course, there are issues of where you get your funding from. As you know, recently, various trustees, at least in museums in the United States, have stood down because the staff in the museum has said, that some of these trustees are involved in all kinds of businesses which do no credit to the sense, the moral mission, the aesthetic and moral mission of the museum. These are very genuine positions. However, there are also positions which may affect the fact that museums tend to get their private monies from major philanthropists, and it is difficult to ask for the full transparency of the philanthropist. It is difficult to go into and ruffle in the pockets of the philanthropist to ask exactly, where the money is invested. Sometimes such very wealthy people, buy a whole package, and a part of their business may be in an area which any cultural institution finds deeply problematic. So these are the social justice issues that have to be dealt with. Trustees may say, this is my contribution to the museum. I've stood by all these principles of the museum. My private investments are my private business. Curators and workers in the museum would say, no, some of those private businesses affect people like me. Not me personally, but there are some of your companies may have racist practices. Some of them may be dealing with warheads and war machines, and we take objection to it. That's the democratic debate which will take place, which should take place at the level of social justice issues, right? So there is no way that that does not immediately impact, although eventually it will impact, or necessarily what you show in your galleries. But I'm saying social justice issues have to be dealt with. But they're dealt with through the kind more, I'm going to be a little simplistic here, say they're more part of the infrastructural aspect of the museum, the institutional part. As far as the cultural rights, I think there are two ways of thinking about it. There's a way in which social justice issues also impact on cultural rights issues. When you make your acquisitions, are you acquiring from the full range of the best aesthetic works that are available to you and that you can afford? Or are you still knitted in to a particular market-oriented, gallery-guided notion of what you should buy, who is a great artist, who's not a great artist? In that context, very often, minority artists fall by. They just don't have the platform or the purchase. So I think one has to be very careful to make sure that you actually see the whole situation of the art world, not only see it through the eyes of the art market, which, of course, as you know, is very seductive, because billionaire collectors may well have their own purchasers, their own advisors, who will buy things which hold their value. But some of these may be very great works of art, but their economic value that is sometimes commensurate with their aesthetic value, sometimes not. But art for investment is very different from art of intervention. You know, the same work may be a great work of intervention and it may cost a lot of money, but we've got to make sure that we get that right. There may be works of great interventional value that may not be value on the market. So a great collector won't want to buy such a work and hand it to a museum because it has no name recognition. But we've got to get into the nitty-gritty of these issues to make sure that the museum gives cultural rights to all subjects and citizens. And I say that because very often artists may be undocumented, they may be refugees, they may be migrants, they're not all citizens. We have got to make sure that we draw the best from the experiences of all people living in the world today. And the experiences of some of them are as citizens, some of them are as undocumented, some of them as displaced people. But all these communities produce great art. I just bought a work of art that I happened to see in a catalog from South Africa, a young artist in his late 20s, for whom the experience of violence in South Africa has the violence to the face. People, whether it's the state, whether it's police, but physical bodily violence. And he has chosen to work in the traditional portrait form. Because in a way, violence is an affront. It creates your facelessness. I just bought this work. He chooses to work in the traditional mode of the portrait, which is often a form about people who have status, right? Who can look themselves in the face. But he's used for those who have no status, for those who have been violated of their status as citizens, as human beings. And so he makes these portraits where the face itself, it's very difficult to focus on the face. The face has got bandages in it. It's got very three-dimensional paint, rather like, say, Auerbach, or Francis Bacon. You can't engage the eyes of the face, but the colors around the portrait are amazing. And the artist says, the more I'm beaten up by the police, the more my dignity is taken from me. I don't simply want to look my oppressors back in the face. I want them to know that I think in beautiful colors. His resistance is to think outside the frame of his of his constraint of those who attack him. And so the unpreparedness of his great work is
Wow.
his experiment with colors.
So you talked about the museum as being this space uh, to show a range of different views and perspectives from different parts of society. But given the polarization of our societies right now, do you think, firstly, that's a feasible role that museums can play to bring these different sites together and to engage in some kind of a dialogue or discussion? And whether museums are themselves are equipped with the right capacities, capabilities to perform this kind of role?
So I think there are two distinct responses there. The first is your aspirational question. Can museums do this? Are museums equipped to mediate, moderate, I use both words, mediate, moderate, and stage the polarized situations? And I think, museums have often done that. At the MFA in Boston, there are portraits of those who were slave owners, and then there are opposing portraits of those who were abolitionists. Now, staging these polarizations 100 years later is different from a modern art museum having to stage them now. But I feel that if there is a profound commitment to doing this, and if there is a careful and reflective intelligence as to how you present the conflicts of society, the museum is a place in which this can be done. It can be done more easily even than in a university, which is a place where that kind of mediation, that kind of conversation is very verbal. In a museum, you have the great advantage of a work that stands there, and whatever it says or it doesn't say, it draws as much upon your emotional and affective being as it does on your intellectual or cognitive. So it is perfectly possible, and that's why I'm glad I gave you the example of this young South African artist. Here he presents a view of the black South African kid beaten up, suffering in all kinds of ways, economically and physically. And then there is a remarkable play of color. Somebody might say, oh, if he's a subject of police violence, maybe he did something bad, maybe he didn't do something. But while thinking that thought, which is the political thought, the eye moves to the color, and the color has a completely different emotional pull on you. So museums could be places where these objects have not only a conversation about some kind of intentionality, but we're always unprepared when we look at a work for things that we never saw, we never believed, things that we can see again when we return to them. I remember when I saw I said to my parents as a child, I do not want to go and visit the Taj Mahal. I have seen so many photographs of it, so many films of it. It bears no interest for me. And then you go and stand there and something happens. And the museum is a place where, quote unquote, something happens. And that something is a very special thing, which is why museums cannot afford to close their doors and windows to issues that they may think are complex.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one last question before we go to questions from the audience because we have so many questions coming in. Yeah, so I agree. I think museums shouldn't shy away from confronting controversial issues through the work that they do. So I want to hear your views about the withdrawal of, or the delay of the Philip Guston exhibition. Do you think that was a right and justified thing to do?
Look, let me say, I am not privy to the specific issues there. So I don't know the technical details of the show. Let me just say this that from everything I have read and the conversations that I've had, I think that Guston's work is of the greatest importance to this moment. Because whatever images Guston may or may not have produced, and there may be some images that some communities would in this moment and in any other moment find problematic, like you would find a swastika problematic. So there are some issues of images of the Ku Klux Klan figures that people just in confronting them might say these are deeply offensive, particularly in the current moment, the what I call "I can't breathe" moment. The effort has to be to take the time. If you these institutions felt they needed time, and I don't know, I can't judge whether the time was too long. I think that they will be probably coming online sooner than they initially thought. But if they needed time institutionally to bring their own, first of all, to bring their own staff, to deal with issues. These issues are issues that the institutions within themselves have to come to terms with. There would be members of the staff who would find this offensive. And I think the important thing is first with your own community of colleagues to make sure that you're on the same page. I assume that that was one of the issues. I don't know, that they had to deal with in this moment. It would be completely also disrespectful to the moment around race that we have seen not to be able to pause, not because we need to make Guston's works acceptable, because Guston's works are the strongest voice in a time such as our own. So they're perfectly relevant and they're perfectly acceptable. And the title of the show, Guston Now, has never been, which was not done in order to talk about the now, but it has never been more important than now. So the question of the power of Guston's work for this moment is not the issue. I think the issue, and I cannot speak for the museums, I speak only for myself, is to make sure how museums could make this very strong work of one of the greatest artists, in my view, of the 20th century, how it could create the conditions of hospitality so that work would be shown it's in its strongest sense. That, and what is the strongest message of the work? The strongest message of the work is, if you don't root out racism, it will, like a cancer, spread everywhere. It'll enter the artist's studio. It'll enter the dreams of people. It will enter the very fabric of society and the very tissue of your body. Therefore, it has to be dealt with. And it cannot simply be dealt with in terms of good intentions and policy, because its psychic and phantasmatic powers are such that we have to think about how we can make sure that that kind of social evil is not able to spread. And Guston is the great voice of that. And in order to make his voice audible, because he was talking about another period and not this one, I think that if the museums felt they wanted to reorient some of their thinking or some of their planning, then we will have to. I think that's not it's not something that you could take objection to, and it is certainly not a demeaning of Guston. It is in fact to ramp up Guston's importance, in my understanding. And if that is the case, I think we have to wait and see. If they're successful, then we'll say that the delay was worth it. If they don't manage to ramp up, to rethink, to relocate the moment to speak to Guston, not only Guston to speak to the moment, then we will have to say the delay didn't actually provide very much to the show. We will have to wait and see. But I can see exactly why it is important to reorient the moment to Guston and Guston to the moment.
Thank you. You made some very good points there. But let's get to the questions, which we have a lot of them streaming in. So maybe I'll start with the first one. Can a museum have the capacity to act swiftly enough to address specific problems of vulnerable communities that arise with such quick turnovers of visibility and vying for attention and globally in the public consciousness? Or can it only remain in a position of archival? So can museums act quickly enough to address these issues that we're now
Well,
facing?
I think having started with the notion of the unprepared at the individual level, at the institutional level, and the governmental level, of course, I think there are different kinds of speeds. Each institution has its own particular time resources and time frames and time plannings. So I think museums, of course, can't act as rapidly as certain governments can, who gave, for instance, in India, migrant workers and wage workers were told to leave and de-densify their cities within 4 hours or 8 hours. Now, this is something which was staggering. Many people suffered, many people died, many people got ill, desperately trying to run out. A government can do that, particularly an authoritarian government can impose such an emergency regulation. A museum cannot impose that regulation either on its own program or on its own staff. And I want to say how important the museum community, the people you work with every day, have to be part of the conversation, have to be brought on stream. There's already a program. So you can't act as swiftly as a more authoritarian government. But I think museums have shown that in their different ways, they have made such decisions. And perhaps, I don't know for sure, the decision to delay somewhat the Guston show is a swift act. It's a swift act. People may disagree, but it is also quickly trying to turn and respond to a great artist in a difficult moment. So I think such quick turnovers of visibility can be organized and are indeed done. Maybe there will not be major shows, but a museum has many things at its disposal. It can do it in its programming, it can do it in its education, it can do it in setting up small shows. I think that is certainly possible. But when I talked about archival sustainability, I was not only talking about the accumulation of works in the museum over time. I'm not talking. I was particularly using that phrase archival sustainability to suggest that whatever your archive is, whatever your great strength is, you have to be able to sustain that program, that collection in the moment, in the current moment. It has to be sustainable. And by being sustainable, I mean not simply that you preserve or conserve your archive, but you change your understanding in your archive. You go down into into the storage and you suddenly find things that you have not shown before, which speak to a moment. So the archival sustainability is the way in which you continually translate and transform your own collection and your own practice.
You talked about the delaying of the Gaston show as being a kind of response and being able to act quickly. But we've also seen museums, especially in America, being unprepared for this current situation, being called out for the kind of systemic racism within their institutions, the lack of diversity. How, at the same time, there you mentioned examples of institutions that have been able to act quickly. Um, do you think museums in general are able to, or do you think they need to be audited further using your own terms?
No, I think no, so you're absolutely right. I propose that what I call auditing is an ongoing process. You know, some may have done it, some may have not done it. Had I had the good luck or the bad luck to belong to a museum, I hope I would have had the good sense to have started this process of auditing. And over time, and I'm not talking simply of auditing in the actuarial or accountant way. I'm talking about an ethical, aesthetic auditing. What do we have to show? What is there in our museum that we have forgotten that could address this present moment? Or the show we are about to do, how do we actually place it for its best advantage to speak to civic issues, to speak to the public world, or sometimes not to speak to the public world, but to speak to a particular group of people who feel underrepresented. And these people who feel underrepresented might be people at one time who are interested in Dutch art. At another time, they may be people who are interested in questions of race in America or the hybridity in Singapore. So it seems to me that you have to. My point about the archival sustainability and auditing is that it's an ongoing process. Now, I think we use the term unprepared in two ways. We use the term unprepared, I suggest, to say, something happens and we are not fully in control of ourselves at that moment. And we've used the word unprepared more like underprepared. We have neglected to prepare ourselves. But let's put those two together. So I think it's a difficult, sometimes when something happens, the porosity of the museum, the fact that the doors of the museum, like of the university, should be open. Something happens on the street, as it happened with George Floyd, and suddenly what happened on the street impacts on the museum gallery. That's not something you could have actually thought about at that time. There may be other anti-racist or anti-systemic racist or anti-inegalitarian policies that you were slowly thinking of doing. But when you get an impact of something like that, the speed of life changes, the speed of time changes, the speed of thinking has to change. You can't be entirely prepared for that. But in all cases, I'm suggesting that opening up the ethical remit of the museum to different groups, to underrepresented groups, must be part of an ongoing audit of the museum in relation to the kind of institution it is. The audit is different in the British Museum than it is in the National Gallery of Singapore, right? You have certain projects, you have certain collections, but you've got to keep that archival sustainability, that sense of translating your collection alive. And so I'm saying that you can never be fully prepared for these, for some rapid intrusions of change. Let's call them rockets of change. You can't be fully prepared for them because that's what they are. But once you encounter them, you can speed up reflectively, not just speed up reactively. That's the problem. I mean, speeding up reactively and saying, I'm guilty, I'm guilty, I'm guilty, I'm a white supremacist, I'm a racist, all this is just words. I want to see in terms of actions, structurally, infrastructurally, what you can do on the two issues I've talked about: social justice, cultural rights.
Hmm. No, I think museums have to change in themselves, the kinds of structures, kind of systems that we kind of use and operate in. Another
Yeah, and the
question we
kind
have
of
here.
governance systems that exist.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the question is, times of crisis are very often seen in retrospect as a flowering of innovations that lead to human flourishing in ways we could not have imagined. Do you think our social contract to one another can be renewed with the notion of shared vulnerability? Is there a silver lining to all of this that's happening right now?
I think this is a very good question. Opal Tometi, who is one of the three women who founded the Black Lives Movement in the United States, recently gave an interview to the Financial Times, and she was asked what she thought the effect of the pandemic was on people's awareness now of the Black Lives Matter movement, um, and and their awareness that um, police forces or forces of the state were attacking minorities, blacks in the United States, or casteless people in India, or Muslims or Kurds in Turkey. And she said she felt that the two things have to be thought together in terms of the vulnerabilities that are are wired in to the world we live in now. That perhaps the pandemic had made us more open to our fragility, to our vulnerability. But again, I would like to say in response to Opel Tometi, you're right. But vulnerability is not a state of nature. It is a historical process too. There are people who have been put in the place of vulnerability. Now, there are some kinds of vulnerability. God forbid you get a bad medical diagnosis, That's a kind of vulnerability that you cannot attribute. But most social cultural forces about vulnerability are not simply natural vulnerabilities. They are vulnerabilities that have been put in place consciously or unconsciously. But we do have a shared vulnerability.
Hmm, thank you. Yes, I think, well, to extend this idea of this auditing that you talked about, I think it's maybe this is the silver lining that comes out of it. How we're becoming more aware of some of these issues, structural issues, historical issues uh, that have resulted in the problems that we are facing around the world today, and how museums can kind of play a role to address some of this. With that, I think we've run out of time. I think we could have spent another few more hours going through all the questions and speaking to you, but thank you so much for joining us, Homi, and for your very rich and meaningful perspectives into what we're all facing today, and the role that art and museums can play as well. I hope to continue this conversation with you at another time. But thank you for joining us again tonight. And for
Thank
our
you,
audience,
Eugene.
please, thank you. Yes, and thank you all of us for joining us, and Homi
Yes,
Bhabha as well.
I
Thank you.
want to thank the whole team. I want to thank you, Eugene, for these extremely interesting questions. I want to thank our audience, and I wish you all in Singapore a lovely evening or a good night. And it would be lovely to see you in person at some point. But thank you for this excellent, excellent event.
Thank you. Thank you.